Hello, it's Future Jess. Kevin was one of the first podcasts I did, but it was a bit long and I didn't really sort of know how to edit it down, so I just kept doing other ones instead. But I finally sort of edited it down, and I'm happy with it. Kevin's quite an interesting story because they were really hesitant to do activism to begin with, but after quite a bit of sort of like subtle or less subtle nudging from me, they did eventually find their place. So I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, how are you, Jess?
I'm good. So I think, usually we start at the beginning. So what was pre-vegan Kevin like?
Oh man, wow. Pre-vegan Kevin was just a normal kid raised in American suburbia, somebody who fancied themselves compassionate and caring and empathetic, who loved animals and did disliked suffering.
Hmm.
Um, Post-vegan Kevin realizes that there was a bit of hypocrisy on that, as their consumer choices, my consumer choices, were basically causing suffering.
Yeah.
So I had to make the change if I wanted to be ethically consistent.
Uh-huh. And how did you sort of get there? Like, were you young? Were you old? Were you middle of the road? How'd you do it?
I was actually middle aged,
Uh-huh.
um, almost exactly. Slight trigger warning for your listeners. You know, there is a bit of an animal companion death story coming up.
Uh-huh.
Um, you can probably put in a link in the description to skip this.
Oh, I will. Don't you worry. Yeah, there's been a few of these.
Yeah, but I had this absolutely adorable cat who she would jump up onto my shoulders and we'd go hunting for bugs that got in the house, and I'd let them outside, her and my other cat, under supervision in the backyard. But Chloe would like run up the tree and hang out and just, the nearest branch was 20 feet high.
Mm-hmm.
um, and she'd just hang out there up in the tree and just be super proud of herself. And then I'd have to get out a ladder and literally climb the ladder, and when she was good and ready, she'd climb onto my shoulders and ride the daddy elevator down. um, Girl had so much moxie. And one day, before my ex started the drying machine, the clothes dryer, she jumped in. And my ex, without realizing it, closed the door, started the dryer, walked away, and went to sleep.
Uh-huh.
A few months later, uh, I was cooking a chicken stir fry, because I used to make a chicken stir fry every night. And I literally, yeah, my ex said, I hate the sound of the chicken frying. It reminds me of Chloe. And I looked down in the pan, and I saw an animal that didn't want to die.
Uh-huh.
And I pretty much went vegetarian on the spot.
Uh-huh.
And that was a huge change for somebody who, considered themselves super compassionate, but used to make jokes like PETA stands for people eating tasty animals. Um, I finally saw an animal that did not want to die. And
Yeah.
for me, it was a light switch, and there's no going back. And that was about 8 years ago.
Wow, that's a hard one. It's the earliest I've ever cried on a episode. That
Oh,
must have
I'm
been really
sorry.
hard. No, don't be sorry.
It was incredibly hard. We both loved her tremendously, and
Mhm.
my other cat too, obviously. Um, but yeah, to lose, a relatively young 5-year-old cat in such a traumatic way,
Mhm.
and I don't blame my ex at all. I know how it happened. She's short, and when she reached over to get the dryer sheets, the plane of the door got out of the way, and this truly was just a horrific accident.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't think anyone would mean to do, that.
no,
Of course not.
yeah.
I'm sure we'll all
So
check the dryer a million times now from now on.
we used to actually have a rule in the house that you'd every time you started either the washer or dryer, you'd close the lid
Mhm.
and find all of the cats.
before
Then
pressing the
you'd go
button.
back to the machine and start it.
Yeah.
That became the rule in the house.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
So, and
Oh.
it's yeah. So that starts my journey. I went vegetarian on the spot, and then I saw a video by Mike the Vegan,
Hmm.
why I'm not a vegetarian, and I watched that, and I realized like if I'm trying to be ethically consistent here, I have to go vegan.
Yeah. Right. So were you quite lucky in that it wasn't very much time between vegetarian to vegan?
It was
Or
about 4 months.
okay, that's way quicker than most people. That's good. Um,
Yeah,
and were
I
you?
am also lucky.
Uh-huh. Go
I
on.
was gonna say I'm also lucky that where I went geographically
Hmm.
was very friendly. So even though the things like Impossible or Beyond did not exist when I went vegan,
Hmm.
um, I was in a large city that had a lot of vegan options available. There were actually a couple of vegan food trucks and even a vegetarian restaurant that had vegan options.
Hmm.
Um, so it made the transition much easier.
Yeah, because you don't have to give anything up if you have wonderful options everywhere, right? It's just having a clean conscience with none of the
Mhm.
sort of like negatives.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Yeah, and I think another thing, I've never really actually thought about this till just now, interestingly.
Hmm.
All of my friends that I had in that area were friends from like a makerspace or in the flying community.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't really have any friends where going out to eat and food was really a big centerpiece of our friendship.
Okay.
Um, so that actually, again,
Hmm.
there's no loss of community on my part for making that transition. I made the transition, and my friends were like, "Cool,"
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, 'cause
like, "All
I
right,
went I went during COVID. Well, just prior to COVID. So like there was no temptation because I just didn't go out for food with anyone. So yeah,
yeah." There were no restaurants.
right? Yeah,
So,
literally. Um, so
yeah,
how are you feeling then? Sort of, presumably you were very committed to vegetarianism and then veganism from the off. Like, there's probably no way in hell you go back without something major happening when that's the reason that you go um, vegan. So, and you say that you didn't really have um, sort of friends that you ate with. So, did you have to sort of like worry too much about like Vistopia, like like feeling like you were in a carnist world as an island, or did that take longer?
it honestly actually took longer to feel dystopia.
Hmm.
The first time, I'd say the first time I felt dystopia was with my family, but again, since I was an adult and my childhood family, we all lived in different places.
Hmm.
Uh, when I came out, so to speak, to them, they it kind of got met with eye rolls and no good for yous. And
Uh-huh.
hanging out with my family has been an interesting mix of we're going to be really accommodating and not accommodating all at the same time.
Okay.
For
In what
example,
way? Uh-huh.
I was just at my uh, visiting my sister and my nieces,
Hmm.
and we went to this Chinese restaurant that all their vegan friends were talking about and saying this is the place to go if you're vegan in this area because
Hmm.
they live in a small town in rural England.
Hmm.
Um, and this is the place to go if you're vegan. It's got the best options, etc., etc. So we go there, and of course they order duck, and
Hmm.
the waitress comes out, puts the duck down next to me, and starts chopping it up into small pieces right in front of me
Oh boy.
when the two carnists are on the other side of the table.
Oh boy.
And they're even pointing out, oh, this must be, really uncomfortable for you. And I'm like, yeah, that's one word for it.
Yeah, it's even more uncomfortable for the duck, is probably what I would have said.
Not by that point. But
Yeah.
sorry, a little gallows humor there.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so
Uh-huh.
I think probably the worst dystopia that I've gone through um, was recently when I went back home. I'm originally from upstate New York, and I
Hmm.
went to see the eclipse, which was amazing. And if you have the chance to see a total solar eclipse in your life, I highly recommend going.
Hmm.
Uh, it is actually magical,
Hmm.
especially if you're a science geek like me. But yeah, upstate New York and deep rural, the Adirondacks, it's just not a vegan friendly place to go. Um, and I was around a lot of family who, again, they're just of the opinion that, oh, well, since you're making this choice, you're used to being like this and you
Hmm.
can worry about your own food. And yeah, we're just going to eat this way and cook this bacon in front of you and, make all your clothes smell like, you know, dead pig flesh and, the standard. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, around
Presumably,
my,
sorry, go
I was going to say around my friends, it's a lot easier.
on. Hmm.
But I'm also starting to work myself into a world where most of my friends are vegan.
Hmm.
So I start to forget sometimes that the world isn't a vegan place.
Yeah. Presumably because you went sort of like vegan as an adult and, all your family experience uh, was, just like non-vegan, and because you sort of don't sort of see them on a day-to-day basis, and it's sort of trip-based, right? So you go spend time with them for a period of time and then you leave. Presumably they just don't really sort of understand what it means to be in the space of a vegan that much, right? Like, because like presumably you guys grew up together cooking and eating animals, and that's just the way
Mhm.
they live. So they don't just think about it. I would imagine they just think it's. Do you know what I mean? Because they don't see you on a day-to-day basis not doing that. I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. And for a lot of it, it's food is so central to people's um, just lived experience, shared cultural experience, that
Hmm.
asking them to change something that's so fundamental to their identity is very difficult.
Mm.
Um, and I think the older people get, there's something to be said about the harder it is for people to adapt to new ideas and change.
Hmm.
For example, I was nearly 40 and it took a super traumatic life event for me. Um, so I have nothing but the most respect for the teenagers who are just like 14, 15, and they're like, Mom, Dad, I want to go vegan. And then they have to fight for years in a Carnist household and live through that dystopian hellscape really for years before they can gain independence and move out at 18 or 20 or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said though for like I think kids are a lot. Well, I'm not sure if more independent earlier makes sense, but like uh, it's easier now I think than it was for parents to just substitute in like plant-based options, right? Like you can make a meal with like normal sausages and then a plant-based sausage, and you can sort of make the same meal, right? I think a lot of vegans grew up that way in that their parents just substituted the bits that were the dead animals, and hopefully they used like plant butter and shit, but hopefully,
Hopefully.
hopefully.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think when we start talking about parents that, willfully lie to their children, the issues go beyond veganism. That's bad parenting, but of a whole
yeah,
different whole
yeah,
different podcast I think could be had on that one.
yeah.
So,
So we move into the interesting subject of sort of like advocacy and activism. I think when we first met all those months ago, like a year ago, this was like a weird spot between us where like I was in a period of my life where I was constantly just like telling people to go to activism. I wasn't very I wasn't very um, gentle in my approach. I was very adamant that everyone should do it. I was a bit hard headed, and I didn't really know the best
what?
way to sort
You?
of yeah me
No.
yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't really
We're
know the
talking about
best.
the same Jess here?
Yeah, the same Jeff. Yeah, she was a dick. I didn't really know the best way to sort of convince people of the benefits, and I sort of just was like, "Go to activism, you fucks." Um, and I remember we had a conversation, and the conversation was sort of like, I don't think I need to go to activism. I have a really like sort of positive effect on people around me just by talking to them. You told me quite a few like success stories of people you did actually sort of subtly and not subtly convince to go vegan just by being their friend, right? I think you have a few of those stories.
I do. One is a friend of mine, so we taught together at the flight school.
Hmm.
She was also a flight instructor there, and just by existing
Hmm.
in essentially a kind of Carnist hellscape that is rural Texas, at the time, there's actually an advantage to that, and there is a general opinion amongst Texans, at least there used to be,
Hmm.
um, that's along the lines of live and let live.
Hmm.
So as long as you're not trying to change or convert me, I won't try and change and convert you.
Hmm.
We could argue whether that's still the case or not. I think it's fading because politics are just getting more divisive. But so just being there, I just said, hey, yeah, no, this is what I do. This is how I live. This is how I eat. These are the foods I eat. And blah blah blah.
Hmm.
And just gave her a bunch of recipe ideas and just made it accessible and like showed her like, hey, on a daily basis, this can be done. And a few months into COVID, I got an email saying, hey, I'm thinking about going vegan. What supplements should I take? And I think I wrote back a 5-page letter on like everything I learned. Like I completely, dumped way more information than she ever needed.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, it was great just by having that kind of positive influence on her and I would bring in vegan donuts because there was a place that sold vegan donuts. So I'd
Hmm.
drive like 30 miles away to pick up vegan donuts and leave them at work and just sort of stick them there. Be like, look, vegan donuts taste like donuts.
That's
Surprise, I
activism.
know.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Yeah, you know. And I still actually do that trick.
Hmm.
Um, so like when I'm on a work trip with the flight crew, I will buy them vegan bakery treats
Hmm.
from whatever city I'm in, and I will give them out to the flight crew and point out that they're vegan.
Hmm.
Just because so many people have this weird, I don't know, view that like, vegan food's just like boiled kale and salt. Wait a minute, is salt vegan? I don't know. I think it's boiled kale, salt, and yeah, soy sauce or something. I don't know.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But yeah, so I still do that. And that I think is actually really good activism as well. Uh, because a lot of people, when you can change their minds just a little bit, you can make them more receptive towards maybe, okay, I ate a vegan treat that was tasty.
Hmm.
Maybe I can eat a vegan meal that's tasty. And so I would find these really great vegan restaurants and I'd take my friends to them or try to take my friends to them
Hmm.
and just be like, hey, let's try this place. And it kind of kills me when, there's when you go to a place and somebody orders a vegan meal and they get a subpar meal. It's not
Yeah.
tasty. There's no presentation.
Yeah.
In the Carnist world, this is totally normal, totally expected. People will just be like, that place wasn't that good.
Yeah.
But because so few people have any experience whatsoever,
Uh-huh.
this becomes their first identifying vegan meal. And they're like, yeah, I tried vegan food once. It was pretty bad.
Yeah.
Like, great. Yeah. How many Omni meals have you eaten that were pretty bad?
Yeah.
But are you willing to admit that? No.
Yeah, and I
So,
suppose like if you're buying donuts as well, like you sort of know they're gonna be good. Like, there's less risk if you buy like a product that you can try and then you know put on the table, right, and be like, eat this. Right? Whereas if you take
oh
someone to a
yeah,
vegan restaurant, you're like, pick something off the menu. I have no idea what any of it will be, unless you've been to the restaurant before and you can sort of like trust most of the menu, right? Um,
Yeah.
but that's harder in some
Yeah.
places than others. Um, and yeah.
I went in my hometown. I went with somebody to uh, a vegan restaurant here that wasn't vegan, and he's like, I want to try the most vegan thing on the menu. Like, what's the most stereotypically? And the waiter was like, oh well, I like the the chicken and waffles, chicken and fries,
Uh-huh.
waffle fries, and it's basically breaded fried cauliflower and waffle fries. And I've
Uh-huh.
had it, and it's terrible. And I tried telling this guy like, no, that's actually not good. Don't eat that, please. Please eat eat anything else here. Like, and he's like, no, that's what I'm gonna try. That's absolutely it. And I'm like, oh god, it's so terrible. Like,
I had a Sunday dinner today with the cauliflower as like the meat replacement, and I was not excited. I thought it was going to not be that good. It was either that or celeriac or butternut squash, and I was like, I wish I could just have more vegetables instead of like one of these done weirdly. Um, but honestly, I just got cauliflower. Like it was just sort of like nicely fried cauliflower, and it was just the more vegetables that I wanted. You know, it was actually pretty nice because it was just I just put gravy on it, and it was just cauliflower with vegetables. It was tasty. Um, Sometimes though, I think like a lot of people who are not vegan, they just straight up don't think they like vegetables. So when they get things like that, when they get cauliflower, they're like, "Oh no, it's more of the stuff I don't like," because they just don't actually like vegetables for whatever reason. I don't know why.
I will tell you, I know the reason. I know the reason. Okay, this is anecdotal. I
Uh-huh.
get this. But I know the reason. When I was a kid, and
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's a bit carnous, but my mom used to make this broccoli casserole. And she would take broccoli and basically Velveeta cheese and just coat all of the broccoli in this Velveeta, which is like, an American plasticky cheese. Do you have
Mhm.
Velveeta there? I don't
We
know.
don't, but I can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually probably vegan because it
Uh-huh.
was, always
Because
like,
it's not real cheese.
yes, no, it's never been real cheese. And she'd top it in breadcrumbs and then she'd bake it. And it was really, really good and tasty.
Uh-huh.
And my aunt that lived out in Ohio was just this total health nut. And when I went out to visit them, it was just me, not the rest of my immediate family.
Mhm.
Um, but when I went out to visit them, my aunt got so super excited that I liked broccoli because her kids hated broccoli.
Mhm.
So she's like, I'm gonna make you a special plate of broccoli for you, a special side dish of broccoli.
Uh-huh.
And when she handed me the broccoli, it, it had been broccoli. Forensic scientists have confirmed that the substance she gave me had, in fact, at one time been broccoli. However, she boiled it beyond the point of recognition
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and didn't use any salt, didn't use any butter, didn't use any seasonings whatsoever. And
Mhm.
I'm like, I've already, now I'm 11 years old. I've committed myself to I like broccoli.
Mhm.
So I'm like, I've got to eat this. But holy crap, it was terrible. And that is why people don't like veggies,
Mhm.
is because they get
Boiled to death.
steamed or boiled to
Mhm.
death.
Yeah.
They have no seasonings, no flavor. Because any of the natural flavor, like raw broccoli, is great. I
Yeah, raw
still to
broccoli
this
is
day would love.
wonderful.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like it makes its way on these veggie platters. You go to a party, there's a veggie platter. Broccoli is almost always on there, and it's one of the things that disappears really quickly. So it's not that people don't like broccoli. People don't like when you boil broccoli to death.
Raw broccoli and hummus is really good. It's, re- it's really nice.
Now you're speaking my language.
So
Yeah.
you spoke about the person at flight school. Have there been anyone else? Has there been any more subtle influences?
Oh, sure. There's been quite a few people that have gotten to start eating more on a regular basis, while not going full vegan. For example, my sister,
Mhm,
so I have two sisters. One lives over in England. One still lives in America, and the one in America is now vegetarian,
mhm,
which is actually very impressive given the uh, the difficulty of her life that
mhm,
has caused that to be a thing. So that's really great.
mhm,
I got a bunch of other friends throughout the time. Like I've managed to convince a lot of my friends to go vegan for once a week. And
mhm,
while that's not a win, when you have, people that have families
mhm,
and kids, and it's like, oh, mom's gonna make, like there's a comic strip in America, Foxtrot, where they're always making fun of the mom for making like tofu sandwiches or whatever,
mhm,
and it's all this big grilling culture and everything.
mhm.
Um, it is hard though with kids to get them to like stuff, but
Yeah.
I've definitely planted the seeds in quite a few of my friends' kids who are, at very young ages contemplating it, but they don't have the familial support.
Yep.
So I have a lot of confidence that as they get older and they become 18 and independent adults, they'll start moving on to this of their own volition. So,
Yeah. I think sometimes with the one meal a week, right? It gets a lot of shit, but like I think it can be important. I once did like I applied for a job, um, and they asked me like what I thought my most uh, impactful vegan product was, and I said the vegan sausage roll. And I said that because like it didn't try and like make a different meal that like was new and interesting. It just sort of proved that you can replace the old sausage roll with something that doesn't like contain animal products and tastes almost exactly the same. And I think if that's sort of the process you use for your one vegan meal a week, and you just sort of try and replicate the meals that you would usually eat in the best way you can without animal products, then I think that sort of sets a precedent that that one vegan meal a week that you make every single week could become more, right? Because like if you decide you're going to have lasagna on a different day than the day you usually have vegan, but you've made the vegan one and you actually quite like the vegan one, then there's no reason why you can't do it that day as well, right? As well as your other one. Um, so I think it can sort of help build habits, right? Um,
of course. Oh yeah.
and it
And
sort of
I think also there's a multifaceted approach that the old saying, different strokes for different folks.
mhm.
Or maybe you don't have that in England. I don't know.
We have
It's an old American.
there's a show with the what you talking about, Willis?
Yeah,
Uh,
different. That was actually different
Different
strokes,
strokes. Yeah,
and it comes from the saying, different strokes for different folks.
yeah,
Uh, and yeah, I think for some people that is going to be the thing that works, and that's like I wish there was a single magic silver bullet that would just, we could have a Thanos level snap and turn the world vegan.
mm-hmm.
That'd be so great, right? But
Mm-hmm.
there isn't, and what works for some people isn't going to work for others.
Yeah.
Um, some people, as an example, to save the relationship, my ex, with my aforementioned cat story,
Mm-hmm.
did go plant based, but never went vegan. And when we split up,
Mm-hmm.
she went right back to eating meat again.
Mm-hmm.
So the same exact traumatic experience
Doesn't work on
had
anyone.
two very different,
Yeah.
right, two very different things. And I wasn't the best at, convincing people back then. I was like, you're such a terrible person for doing this. And now I mean,
Uh
sometimes
huh.
still feel like that, but I have to be
Diplomatic.
patient and
Yeah.
meet people where they're at.
Yeah. 100%. 100%.
Um,
I think that's a really
so,
important part of any sort of advocacy and any sort of outreach is the ability to understand that you can only do so much good, and that by trying to do more good than you're able to do in any situation might actually make you do less good, right?
mhm.
With a lot of trolls, I'll like the only thing I'll say like at the end of a conversation will be like, every time you pay for this, like you contribute to something that is bad. So like, why don't you try plant-based options? Why don't you try the plant-based burger or whatever wherever you go? like for food, um, because like if you're super entrenched, then sometimes you need to try some of the options first, right, before you can even contemplate just going vegan. Um,
Hmm.
Unfortunately. Um,
Yeah, and a lot of people have I think, a predisposition, a cultural
mhm,
predisposition to avoid these things for so many different reasons. Like one of these reasons would be just simply because, you know, they've gotten a lot of brainwashing that this vegan food is bad and is unhealthy and
mhm,
not tasty.
mhm, mhm,
Other people are pushing it as it's part of some, you know, mind control agenda, that the ivory tower elites are using to manipulate us, and other people are, they have like so many different reasons. And a
mhm.
lot of people just like their tradition.
Yeah.
It's a much more innocuous thing, but like, oh, I come from a very meat heavy culture. You know,
Mhm,
my relatives, when we go out to the farm and wherever, we grab a pig and we slaughter it and we, spin it over a roast, and
mhm,
that's the centerpiece of the party for 4 hours while we, and like that's just such a huge
mm,
central part of their family experience.
mhm.
You're asking them to change their entire social fabric, and people, they don't like that. So you
No.
do have to meet them where they're at. And if
Yeah,
you can get them
yeah,
to eat one meal, well, hey, that's one meal, and that starts to change slowly. So
yeah.
then maybe that pig on a spit becomes less important.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah. Or they sort of, start realizing that it is an animal, right? It's not a food. Or yeah.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, exactly.
we have a sort of mutual friend who I spoke earlier about, like how maybe I wasn't the best at convincing you to go to activism. But we have a mutual friend who was convinced um, to go to activism, and you're both people who travel around a bit because of your work. And although I didn't convince you to go, I believe they did, and I think that was your sort of first foray into activism, into quote unquote organized activism, shall we say? Um, so
Uh,
like,
if you're talking about Finley,
no, no,
I
not
was the
Finn,
one.
not Finn,
Okay.
Nugs.
Oh, all right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh huh.
So, um, yeah, he's got a job. He travels around a lot for a living
Uh
as
huh.
well. He was coming through my neighborhood, and I was like, well, come hang out.
Uh
We'll go grab a tasty dinner. We'll just hang out, chill. And we went to a disruption event,
huh.
and I met some cool people there who are very passionate, involved, and care. Um, but that sort of activism, it did make me honestly uncomfortable. Um, I have a very public facing job, and I, I am worried about any kind of political thing kind of bleeding into my work. Uh, just by the nature of these people knew of this other group, and they suggested that perhaps this was more up my alley. And what this group does, the Pro Animal Future group, is in the several states in America, we can actually do citizen initiative ballots. And this can be used for good, it can be used for bad, it can be used for completely mindless and neutral. But basically, the idea is you collect a large number of signatures, and it varies from municipality to government or agency, right? But you collect signatures, you get the initiative on the ballot, and then the ballot can be turned into law. The people of Ohio actually did this after Roe versus Wade was overturned. The people in Ohio actually did a citizens initiative ballot to protect abortion rights in the state of Ohio. So it's a very powerful tool that leaves power in the governing in the hands of the people. We've got two. One is to ban the sale of new fur in the city of Denver, and the other is to ban slaughterhouses inside
Wow.
the city of Denver.
Uh-huh.
Um, and basically, we've collected the ballot signatures. We've
Hmm.
got this on the ballot now, and it will be being voted on with the 2024 presidential election. At the same time, people will have to answer
Wow.
the questions for themselves. They will have to sit there and say, yes, I am okay with animal agriculture as it stands. I am okay with CAFOs and slaughterhouses
Hmm.
doing what they do. Or
Hmm.
they can make the decision, no, I am not okay
Hmm.
with the status quo. I'm not okay how things are done.
Hmm.
Let's make this change. So
Okay. So,
yeah,
do you know how many other things are on the ballot? Is it just those two things, or is it?
from us, yes. There's
Oh,
also another group that's in terms of animal rights, trying to ban big cat trophy hunting in the state of Colorado.
okay.
So that's going to be another one. And then there's a few other things. So uh, there's a last election cycle, there was a big money funded push to put a limit on taxes. That was basically a giveaway to the rich.
Hmm.
But the way it was worded, it made people think that, it would, save them money on taxes. But
Hmm.
it was, you know,
No.
there's another one for school choice, which for those of your listeners that aren't familiar, school choice is basically a way to take funds away from the public school system and you can put it towards private religious education of your own choosing.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, so if you have like let's say a municipality says it costs us $20,000 per student
Hmm.
to educate them at the public school. I want to send my kid to um, you know St. Mary's School for the conservative right that doesn't believe in evolution.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Uh,
So my point was more like, how easy is it to like overlook these ballots? Like, are they really obvious? Like, can you just not fill them in, or do you have to fill them in? Like, how is
it is
every
possible
single?
to not fill.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, it's possible. So you'll have your president on the ballot. You'll have your depending on what state you live in and where it falls in the state senators. You'll have your House of Representatives. That's all the federal government stuff. Then you have your state stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and literally, like if I wanted to on a Colorado ballot,
Hmm.
I could literally vote in favor of this one proposition and leave the president blank. I don't even actually. I can still vote
Uh-huh.
and not vote for the president.
But
Most people don't do that.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
Right.
But
So.
like, it's not like on a separate piece of paper. It's not like hidden away somewhere. It's right there, like with little
Mhm.
checkbox. Yes, no.
Correct.
Okay. And
And
sorry,
one
go.
nice thing I like that
Uh-huh.
Colorado does a really nice thing too as well. They send out a voter guide,
Hmm.
and in the voter guide they list each proposition, and they send it out in English, they send it out in Spanish,
Uh-huh.
and they list each proposition on the ballot,
Uh-huh.
and they allow arguments for and arguments against. So you actually do get to read
Amazing.
both sides, the
Uh-huh.
argument being given from both sides.
That was literally my next question. So that's good. So whilst you are in sort of the process of trying to educate people prior to the vote, which way they should vote, if someone had never interacted with you, and had no sort of context, they would still have some sort of information to help them decide which box to tick.
Correct.
That's amazing. That's really good.
Yeah.
So to some extent, you've
Oh,
sort of used the state as a form of outreach, right? Because they're
mhm.
sending out your information, and obviously, and the counter proposals. The opposition's sort of statement as well. But like they sort of get that information delivered to them, just as standard as part of the voting package. Um,
Yeah,
that,
actually, I hadn't really thought of it, but that is actually something we're doing for sure.
that's very cool. That is very
Yeah.
cool. So how long have you been doing Path then? How long have you been engaged with that?
I've been engaged since probably about the beginning of the year.
Okay.
So it's interesting because I was really hesitant to get involved in any kind of activism, again, because of my job.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, I can't be involved in anything illegal,
Mhm.
uh, or else I not only go to jail potentially, but I lose my job.
100%.
And yeah, that would be very bad.
Mhm.
Very, very bad. Um, so it's not even like I have the ability, and I respect and I'm jealous of the people that have the ability to get arrested
Mhm.
uh, in support of the cause that they believe in.
Mhm.
Um, I unfortunately don't have that luxury. So I've been very careful about the kind of activism that I get involved in.
Mhm.
And this provides me a completely legal avenue
Mhm.
uh, to be involved in activism. And it also gives me uh, a great way to approach it with some people who might otherwise not be interested in hearing anything about it.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh yeah, no, we're working on this ballot initiative, and you know, on a scale of 0 to 10, where do you find on that? And sometimes people will honestly engage, and other times they're like, my uncle, like so many uncles have friendly farms where all the animals live a happy life.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's something I didn't know before I became vegan, is that everybody's got an uncle that owns a farm where all the animals live a happy life.
Yeah. They all die of old age. And
Hmm.
yeah. And
Hmm.
they keep all the roosters. They have all the roosters.
Oh, they do. Oh,
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So you've
It's
been doing this for about sort of like 5 months, 6 months, and
yeah.
are you
Well, actually, a little bit less. Now that I think
uh
about it, yeah, it would be last year. It'd
okay,
be probably November timeframe.
okay, wow.
Yeah.
And did you start out as a volunteer, or are you what sort of stuff do you do? Because I think you do canvassing, but like to what like are you going and knocking on doors, or how do you engage with the public?
So there's four main things that I do with this group. One is a purely social
Hmm.
aspect, and I actually really appreciate the fact that this exists. Is
Uh-huh.
that we can have a group where we can just come together in a social environment and we can talk about whatever, not necessarily the campaign.
Uh-huh.
So that's one thing. Another thing that we do is we are handwriting a lot of postcards,
Hmm.
and we're going to be sending them to Denver voters. Um, we tried the mass email or mass text method,
Hmm.
and I would say probably like 95% of the responses we got were stop. And
Yeah.
then it was pretty 50-50 as to anybody else that did engage with us.
Uh-huh.
Uh, they were either like, "Oh my God, yes, I'm a 10. Totally support this,"
Hmm.
and then other people were like, "I'm gonna go eat two burgers because of you."
Yeah.
It's like, all right, well, and that costs us a lot of money, right? Like
Yeah.
the corporation that we used, it was like, I don't know, 10 cents a text or something. So it
Wow.
got
Okay.
to be pretty expensive.
Hmm. It's a lot of voters
And
in Colorado, I imagine, or Denver,
well,
I
it's
suppose.
also only the city of Denver,
Yeah.
but it is the most populous city in Colorado, so that would be the bulk of it anyway.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so we got the postcard writing thing. Then we've got uh, postering and deep canvassing.
Hmm.
And what we do with the postering is we're just going around putting up posters like anyone else with information, a QR code, a quick little snippet,
Hmm.
hopefully bring attention to it. Um, and so people can see this
Hmm.
and like, oh, hey, I didn't even know this was a thing. Cool.
Hmm.
Um, and then the deep canvassing idea. What that is we're going out to parks, we're knocking on doors, and we are talking to people. And we actually, this idea comes from the many years that marriage equality advocates failed to get marriage equality passed in the state of California. And
Okay.
after one particularly devastating election where poll after poll after poll showed that the majority of the people supported marriage equality.
Mhm.
And yet it was voted down. They were obviously extremely deflated. And they said, okay, we need to just figure out why.
Mhm.
And that's what they did. They went out and they talked to voters and just said, why?
Mhm.
Tell us your story. And that's the beginning of the point where it turned. When there's one particularly moving video where this guy's like, "Yeah, my sister's a lesbian. I didn't vote in favor of it. I knew it was right, but like I just was afraid of what it would mean and the change." And he broke out in tears.
No.
And of course, the person who was doing the deep canvassing did not sit there and call him a terrible person and say,
No.
"Well, the
Uh-huh.
hell is wrong with you?" And they're just like, "Yeah, I understand. Like, there's a lot to be afraid of when you have a big change like this. That makes sense." And they were just very compassionate and kind. And then, as we all know, like it did end up becoming legal.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But going out on those one-on-one conversations really did convince a lot of people to vote and really make them think and confront. But you can't just go up and say, "Hey, I've got this thing, vote for
Uh-huh.
it." you know, um, you do have to again meet them where they're at. And so the first step that we do is we go out and say, "Hey, on a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10,
Uh-huh.
depends on if you're a comp sci geek and you want to be zero indexed or one indexed.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, how do you? We're trying to ban slaughterhouses. How do you feel? Like zero, there's nothing wrong with animal agriculture as it stands. 10, it's all horrible and it all needs to change.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And we can live our lives without animal agriculture." And the few times I've done this, you go out and you start talking to these people, and you find there's a lot of 5s to 7s.
Okay, and
And even,
seven is seven. Sorry, dyslexia. Remind me, is seven closer to good or closer to bad than five?
7 is closer to the idea that slaughterhouses and animal agriculture should end.
Okay, okay, okay. So
So,
people skew towards, not wanting to have animals die. Middle of the road
correct.
to okay, okay, okay.
Yep. And people realize it's the current system that we have is unsustainable, it's unhealthy,
Mhm.
but that's just the way it is, and that's all. Like there's a lot of defeatism in there,
Mhm.
and it's kind of nice because some of them realize like we're giving them a tool to actually have a choice.
Yeah.
Um, but that yeah, so once we get their initial statement, their initial number, then we go on. We'll say, hey, why do you feel that way?
Mhm.
Because everybody has a story,
Mhm.
and the funny thing is, everybody there's the governor of South Dakota right now. Everyone's really pissed at because she callously just shot her dog, rather than training it.
Mhm.
And universally, everyone, right wing, left wing, they're like, "Wow, what a horrible human being." um, because most of us do realize deep down that animals should be treated well. It's
Yeah.
not like it's not some weird conspiracy or weird mind control thing. It's just part of who we are. We want to treat other creatures, other sentient beings well. And so most people do have a story,
Mhm.
and you try and get that story out of them, and you potentially share your story.
Mhm.
And in my case,
Talk about the
I
cat.
don't use the cat one
No,
because
you
it's a
don't.
little too traumatic.
Uh-huh, uh-huh,
You know,
uh-huh.
I'll use in that kind of scenario, I use the much more mundane thing of like, yeah, when I was a kid, I was at this diner
Mhm.
in upstate New York, and my dad ordered the veal, and I said, "What's veal?" I
Oh.
didn't know, and
Uh-huh.
he's like, "Oh, it's baby cow," and I was like, "Baby cow? That's horrible." And he said, "Well, you know, it's just a byproduct of the dairy industry, and
Uh-huh.
that's you know, that's
Oh.
just the way it is." And I was like, "Oh, that sucks." Like, why is it just the way it is? Like, why are you doing this? Why are you eating a baby animal?
Mhm,
Like, even as a little kid, I was horrified
mhm.
at this thought, and my dad was just like, nope, that's just the way it is, you know. Um, and I don't think my dad was a bad person, but that's the
No.
way he was raised.
Yeah, right? Yeah. It's sort
So,
of generationally it gets easier and easier to realize that things don't have to be the way that they were
hmm
100 years ago, you know?
right.
Yeah.
So that's like the story that I'll share.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of people will connect with that
Mhm,
because they too were found out something that they didn't like.
mhm,
And it's like, oh, yeah, I found out like this thing about animal agriculture that I found horrifying.
mhm, mhm,
And so now we can start to work on that compassionate level and say,
mhm,
listen, here, we've got a chance to make the change. You know, we've talked about it. Where do you fall now on that scale of 0 to 10?
mhm,
And hopefully what we've been able to do is we've been able to move them from a 5 to a 7 and a 7 to a 9.
mhm.
You know, I don't know that if somebody comes out of the gate screaming I'm a 0 and they end the thing with I'm a 10, I don't think that's genuine at all, right?
I think
But I
some
think with the
tens, right? Some tens are probably just vegans, right? Um,
if they come out of the gate as a 10, they're probably vegans.
oh
But
yeah,
if they come out of the gate as a 0 and at the end of the conversation they're like, "Oh, you convinced me I'm a 10."
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's just patronizing.
Yeah, yeah, I've had some outreach conversations like that where, it didn't feel great, and then they're all of a sudden they're like, "Yeah, I'm vegan now," and you're just like, Are you just saying this to get me to leave you alone? I don't know. Yeah, yeah, I sort of know that one. So how you must have had quite a lot of conversations. You, I think you had presumably since your first interaction with sort of organized activism was sort of disruption. Like you had a very sort of negative sort of like feedback from the people you were sort of trying to reach out to. This, I would imagine, way less so. Presumably, at worst, people are like, "Stop wasting my time." Um, but at best, presumably, people actually genuinely want to have conversations with you.
I think most people, when you're first in the park,
Mm.
still don't.
Yeah,
You know, like
yeah,
I'm in the park, I'm just enjoying my day, right? And
yeah.
like, dude, I don't. I agree with everything you're saying, but man, I'm here with my wife, my kids. I'm here just with my book on a beautiful Sunday away from work. Like,
Uh-huh,
come on, I just want to read, man. Like, come
uh-huh,
on. Um, so yeah, that is a little bit tough. But most people are at least polite about it, and they're not like screaming in your face, angry and negative.
mhm,
Um, I would say, yeah, the vast majority of interactions definitely go far more positive,
mhm,
as opposed to the first experience where I went out and did something. It was the vast majority were far more negative. Um,
mhm,
so, and it's nice because I think a lot of the people do start to, if you can come at them with a non-judgmental way and just ask them questions, ask them to share their stories, and do your best to not judge them and not
mhm,
tell them they're a bad person
mhm,
and find empathy and say, yeah, I understand. We were raised in this society. Of course,
mhm.
that is what's normal and natural to you. So of
Yeah,
course you would feel that way.
yeah, yeah.
And if they feel that you're actually being genuine with that, I think it does make them start to question things. And again, some people, they've got all the spoons in the world
Mhm,
when most of us are just trying to survive. And yeah, you talk to somebody on the street, they might not have the spoons that day.
mhm,
And you can't make them feel guilty about that.
mhm,
And yeah, it's great when you do make a connection and get people to think about it because I use myself as an example here. The first time I met a vegetarian,
mhm,
I was 24 years old.
mhm,
I was in a bar and this angry girl comes up to me and was like, "Do you know what hot dogs are made of?" And my friend Andy and I were like, "Yeah." all the leftovers. They're tasty though.
Yeah.
We just didn't even care, right? Like
Yeah.
it didn't matter what she said.
Mhm.
Well, it might have, but the things she was saying were falling on absolutely deaf ears.
Yeah.
And you know, obviously, there's been a huge change in me and my life, but
Yeah.
yeah, it took about 16 years from the time that I met that first person
Yeah.
before I made the full leap to go completely vegan
Yeah.
and say, I'm done exploiting animals.
Yeah. And
So I'm
sorry.
happy if I
Mhm.
can plant a seed and get people to think about it.
Mhm.
Like, if every single person I talked to about veganism went vegan in 16 years,
16 years from now,
I would,
yeah. That's not bad,
I
right?
would be so happy.
You just go
Like,
you just go into schools, right? Be like, hey, don't eat animals. And then, 26-year-olds are all vegan, right? Um,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
And, and I do think when we hit a critical mass, it's going to be much easier. Again, food is such a common cultural thing. I've got a friend from college.
Mhm.
His father was Catholic, his mother was Jewish. And they raised him in both faiths and said, when you're old enough, you can decide which one or none you want to follow on your own.
Mm.
And he chose Judaism. You know why?
Go on.
The food holidays.
Ah.
Literally, all the celebrations that revolved around feasting.
Mhm.
And he's like, I love that so much. And it's such a thing. A friend of mine lived in Michigan,
Uh-huh.
and there was a big problem with a lot of the Mexicans that had moved into this one neighborhood, and it was causing a lot of racial disparities. And one day, the Mexicans decided that they were going to throw a community barbecue, and unfortunately, it was very carnist with hot
Mhm.
dogs and hamburgers and that sort of thing. And they invited the entire community over to
Mhm.
this just community barbecue,
Mhm.
and they pretty much eliminated the majority of their racial problems that day by
Yeah.
reaching out and having a food centered
Mhm.
thing. It's like, hey, look, we're not really any different from you. Like,
Yeah.
and food is this thing. It brings us together, these feasts, these celebrations. In America, we have Thanksgiving,
Mhm.
um, where the whole idea is we get together and we celebrate a feast.
Mhm. Speaking of feasts, I feel like we jumped past a very big point, and this is a perfect tangent place to start or to come off onto it. You said the first thing that you do with Path is social stuff, and we
Hmm.
touched at the start with like dystopia and sort of social isolation and not really having a vegan community. Uh, this seems like a perfect time to say like, what are those socials? And like, presumably not everyone's vegan in Path, but I would imagine a large number are, and I would imagine your
Hmm.
socials are vegan, right?
The socials are vegan food,
Uh huh.
absolutely. No, not everyone in PATH is vegan, and in fact, we would love to recruit more non-vegans
Hmm.
uh, to be working with us because I think it's easier to receive a message about how something is wrong from someone else who is involved in that
Hmm.
life and realizes it's wrong and is trying to get out of that life themselves and is trying to make the changes, but isn't quite there yet. Versus the high and mighty vegan who's going to sit there and say, it's easy. You
Hmm.
know, like I have to be very careful when I'm talking to my coworkers and they're like, oh, isn't it super hard to do it? And I'm like, well, I've been doing it for 8 years. So it's really not hard now, but like you do
Uh-huh.
anything for 8 years, it's going to be easy.
Yeah.
In the beginning, it was really hard. I'm not going to lie,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
We can't trivialize the difficulty in the transition.
Mhm.
So yeah, it is an easier message to hear. But sorry, I got distracted. To your point on this, yes, the socials are vegan.
Mhm.
Not every member is vegan. Uh, we get a volunteer to make a large plate of food,
Mhm.
or several volunteers, and then we meet up and we'll just hang out and talk and feast and
Mhm.
celebrate good food and share recipes, which is just like so many of these other community socials that you would have. You know, you'd go to your parish potluck, and they'd have it at the parish recreation center,
Mhm.
and people would just bring food and have this feast and just get together. And the whole purpose of it, yes, the people going were members of your local community parish, or I don't actually even know what you do. You call them parishes in England for the COE?
I think we just call them churches. I don't know. Yeah, church. I don't know. I've never really been to one. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I mean, I know y'all have like the vicar, and
Yeah.
but yeah, so
Uh.
this sort of community thing, right? It's just like,
Uh.
hey, let's get together, let's feast,
Mhm.
let's have this shared experience, and it's nice. It kind of helps realize, like, hey, we can still do all of the things that make us human.
Uh.
We aren't really sacrificing anything.
Yeah. And like, how many people we talking? How often we talking? How sociable is sociable? How lucky are you?
Very. To
Uh
answer that
huh.
last question, very lucky.
Uh huh.
You know, I've made friends that I can go skiing with.
Uh huh.
Uh, and you know, the two of us went skiing, and a couple of his friends joined. And the one started making carnist jokes because he didn't know either of us were vegan. And the third friend, who was not vegan but knew that Nathan and I were vegans, were he was just getting a little uncomfortable. And his jokes were just falling on deaf ears, and it was actually kind of great. But then afterwards, my friend was like, "Yeah, I forgot what it's like to hang out with carnists, because like I just don't hang out with them ever." It's like really kind of nice
Uh huh.
when you know your social group is full of people that do actually care. Um, you know, it is nice when you find people that are like, "Oh, I'm super into astrology," and you're like, that's not really my thing."
Uh huh.
Um, but that's like a minor, like, "Oh, we're both vegan." Yeah, cool. Um, no, it's really great to have this social group. So in terms of numbers, it's biweekly, every other week,
Uh
every
huh.
other Saturday. Although there are some other like smaller things where people will post like, "Hey, I'm gonna have a movie night. We're gonna watch such and such movie. I'm gonna have a game night. Hey, I'm gonna do a postcard social where we're gonna write a bunch of postcards and we'll watch this movie." So like the postcard writing itself is a social. As far as the socials, the numbers vary. This past week, this weekend, currently as we record this, is Memorial Day weekend in the United States. So it's a big camping holiday, and so most people were gone. And I would say that still well over 20 people showed up.
20.
Yeah.
20 with most people gone. What the hell?
Hmm.
What like
Hmm.
what numbers are we talking when people aren't mostly gone? What the hell?
I've definitely seen socials where there's been at least 30 or 40 people there.
Wow, that's wild. That
Yeah.
is crazy.
Yep.
And these are
So,
bi-weekly along with other stuff. That's mental. And when we say like not everyone's vegan, like is it like half's vegan? Is it like
oh no, it's way more than. So
uh
one of our founders partners is, for example, vegetarian, working towards vegan,
okay.
trying to be vegan.
Mhm.
Um, there's quite a few people, and so this is actually something that we're trying to avoid in the group itself. Also, is avoid use of the V word,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
um, because it is a very political word. It does turn people off.
yeah. Mhm.
Um, and it's hard, right? You know, you go up to somebody on the street, you're like, "Hey, I'm working on this thing.
Mhm.
Where are you? I'm a 10." And you're like, "Oh my God, that's great. I'm a lifelong member of PETA." You're like, "Oh my God, that's great. I do this, 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 and this for animal activism." You're like, "Oh my God, that's great. Are you also a vegan?" And they go, "No." And now suddenly
Yeah,
they feel judged.
yeah,
And
yeah. So most are, but like so I do activism with like THL, and I love THL. I think they're really inclusive. I think they're really supportive of like their activists, but it's not an entirely vegan organization. I know there are non-vegans in THL. I have no idea who they are, because almost everyone I've ever spoken to is vegan. and it's kind of awkward in every time you meet a new person. For me, I'm always like, I just need to make sure that this person is vegan because I do a lot of vegan activism, and if they're not, like, they're gonna get real offended by just the casual things I say, probably if I'm not careful. So I have to be a little bit different with people until I realize that it's safe to just be myself. Um, and I'm okay with that. Um, and I don't want to not, I wouldn't want people like not to come to THL who weren't vegan. Um, but there is like a funny game that like is that's the difference, I suppose, between like vegan outreach and like other sort of forms of activism that aren't predominantly like individual accountability veganism. Um,
Hmm.
but one of the things I've really noticed, so I eventually got to my point. One of the things I really noticed about doing THL stuff is that a lot of people joined THL as non-vegans, and then they very quickly found veganism through joining the activism, through doing it. I would imagine that's similar in PAF, in that a lot of people who are working towards veganism are doing so because they're surrounded by so many vegans.
I I do think that that is actually, yeah, I would agree with that assessment. And it's one of those things where I have to be cautiously optimistic.
Uh huh.
But yeah, when people get involved, um, and they find a good community,
Hmm.
and that's so important, right? Like, to us as people, we have basic human needs, and we're a social creature.
Hmm.
We are a social animal.
Hmm.
Even if you're an introvert, you still need some level of community.
Hmm.
And by providing that level of community where the people around you, the general thought process is this, it makes it more acceptable for you to consider that point of view,
Hmm.
um, and adopt it.
Hmm.
It's just truly easier because you've taken away a lot of those barriers, right? Like,
Hmm.
oh, I come from a really meat based culture where we have the turkey roast on the table at or the roast beast,
Hmm.
and the centerpiece of the table is always this meat thing.
Hmm.
And so now you've provided that same social community atmosphere without the meat.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, hey, I actually don't need this. And then they can start interrogating their own beliefs.
Yeah, it's almost like you're doing it the opposite way around, right? Because most people go vegan and then they find their community. It's almost like with things like THL and things like Path, you give the community to anyone who is willing to join in the activism, and then they have that community, so they don't need to be lonely vegans when they finally get there, right? And
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
yeah,
totally, totally.
that's kind of
And
cool.
it's great too because I think the number one problem most new vegans do suffer when they watch a documentary online. Like, I've got another friend.
Mhm.
Um, she watched Cowspiracy,
Mhm.
called me up. She went vegan overnight,
Mhm.
and that lasted about 3 months. But she lived in rural Texas where
Uh-huh.
there was no community around,
Mhm.
and so people just sort of like, oh, this is just a passing phase. Whatever, you'll get over it.
Yeah.
And they just kept living their lives and didn't support her. And yeah, she's right back to eating meat again.
Yeah.
Um, there was no support. I imagine that that story would be very, very different had she had a community that was supportive of adopting this as a ethical framework and really solidifying it as a part of your identity before going out into a area where you didn't have any support.
Yeah. No, yeah, I totally understand that. I think maybe I think a lot of people in animal rights activism are on the sort of autism spectrum, and they don't really understand like this want to not be a social pariah. um, and I am
Yeah.
I am autistic, and to some extent I don't really mind being a social pariah in some regards, but it that's not the case for everyone, right? And not everyone is able to just ignore society's conditioning. Um, and I think we sort of a lot of sort of people who are on the autistic spectrum and our activists really don't understand that, really don't give that any credence at all. Um, and even if you do make the point, well, the animals deserve us to just ignore that. It still doesn't mean you shouldn't cater to it, right? It still doesn't mean you shouldn't, if you can help these people build that community first, and then it's the transition is easier, then we should do it, right? We shouldn't just be like, no, you need to be a martyr, no, you need to be, because the point is to make like animal liberation, right? It's not everyone should have to do it in the perfect way. It's just let's get to animal liberation, however we need to get there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
um, so
Oh, for
yeah,
sure, for sure. Yeah.
right.
So,
So at this point in the podcast, we usually talk about um, the future and what you hope things will happen. What you want to do next, and sort of what you hope. Presumably you hope that your ballot passes. Um, and if it does, like, what might you do afterwards? If it doesn't, what might you do? Things like that.
well, I think. Okay, so let's work on the future if the ballot passes.
Okay.
Um, the organization as a whole is primarily dedicated to collecting data and analysis to see what's working, what's not working, what's
Mm-hmm.
effective, what's not effective. And the idea is to then study all of the data that we have. And this is whether it passes or fails. Study the data that we've got and start working with other municipalities, other states,
Mm-hmm.
other groups, and say, look, this is what we did. This was really effective. This was not. Let's try this again. You know, maybe we
Mm-hmm.
could get a slaughterhouse ban passed symbolically in a city that didn't have any slaughterhouses,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, oh, well, yeah, sure, we'll just ban a slaughterhouse. It's not like it's an actual thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe we won't, maybe we won't get it passed in Denver.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, if it fails, I'll continue working on it here in Denver. I'll
Uh-huh.
continue talking to people, and I'll take the fact that we've got several more years of talking to people, and we've just got a lot more work to do. And
Mm-hmm.
if it does pass, we'll definitely celebrate and try and grow it. That's, I think, the ideal future.
Okay.
And that's as far as the activism is concerned. And then I think the mix, I wouldn't have thought of this actually prior to this conversation
Mm-hmm.
as activism, but our discussions actually have made me start thinking like the future will actually continue to hold these social events
Yeah.
where we get together and we have these communities based around just a shared community, a shared value, and
Uh-huh.
we celebrate with food
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing. So continuing to have these these social groups where we show up and we we just celebrate each other's accomplishments on an individual level. I would have thought that was more of a personal thing
No,
and
no.
not
Community
an
building is activism.
activism thing.
No, no. Community building is
Before this
activism.
kind of yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think absolutely continuing to do that
Mm-hmm.
is something that would be huge. Absolutely be a huge part of my future
Yeah.
moving forward.
I think it's worth like mentioning as well that like when you have these conversations on doorsteps, right? Like even if you weren't working towards a ballot, right? Even if the ballot was in 4 years' time, let's say, right? Having that conversation about something that will be on the ballot in 4 years' time might not meaningfully contribute towards that ballot passing, but it's a way of sneaking a conversation in about animal rights, right? It's a
Mhm.
way of literally being on someone's doorstep or wherever you meet this person and saying like, "Hey, I want you to talk to me about this thing because you're going to have to vote on it." And they think, "Oh, I'm going to have to vote on this. I should have this conversation. If I'm going to have to vote on it, I should have this conversation." And then you speak to them about animals, right? Which is a conversation you might want to have with them for other reasons, right? Regardless of the ballot, because you might want them to consider animals. So it's sort of a great way of like having a cheeky conversation with someone. Um, that they sort of feel more sort of like that they should speak to you about, right? Like it's a way of getting people's attention. And then obviously, I sort of, it's like a promise, right? I think I've used this analogy before, but like when you say "I promise," it is both saying you are promising and also making the promise, right? So when you sort of say, "Hey, there's this thing on the ballot that you need to worry about," like, it's about animal rights. You're sort of asking them if they want to speak about animal rights, but also you're going to now have a conversation about animal rights, right? Like if you just go up to someone on the street and go, "Hey, speak to me about animal rights," they're like, "Why?" But if you say, "Hey, there's this thing on the ballot," you know, they sort of have to listen to you, right? I think it's really cool. I think it's a great way of sort of initiating activism. Kind of wish we could do it in
Yeah,
the UK somehow.
I think with the data that we collect and the experience that we gain,
Mhm.
um, this sort of thing is something that you can do, if not in terms of a ballot representation, but with modifications of that, um, you can definitely do it because you can still petition your government, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, like, you can maybe just if you have the petition, you can go out there with the petition and say, "Hey, we're looking for signatures. How do you feel about this?" And
Uh-huh.
whereas we were like, "Hey, we're doing this. Do you want to sign?" And people were like, "Oh my God, hell yeah, let's do it."
Uh-huh.
Um, you could maybe have your more in-depth conversation then and say, "Hey, yeah, we're petitioning government for." I'm just spitballing that idea.
I'm gonna run for. I think Mama needs to run for parliament and get my door knockers, my canvassers, to just have vegan conversations. We're not even with the intent of getting elected, just as a way to excuse like knocking on people's doors to speak about veganism.
Well, I
Funny
mean,
idea.
my understanding of the current state of British politics is that as long as you're not a Tory, you'd have a chance of winning this next one.
Yeah, literally. Might not be. I might not have time to register though. Well,
Yeah,
yeah, but yeah.
less than 2 months. Hurry.
So what
Uh,
about so is there any sort of interest in branching out these socials and doing more things? Like if let's say the ballot does sort of break down, and you would have to wait a significant number of years before you can redo it. Like, might you consider like repurposing these socials um, as like another thing, right? Because like there are other ways of just like getting people to join your socials, right? And like growing a community that isn't activism focused, right? Like you can, I don't know, but like if the main goal was just grow the community as big as possible in order to sort of like subtly create veganism, like is that something you think
I think
is?
there's definitely interest, and I think that's starting to happen organically in the group.
Mhm.
For example, at the social last night, we were talking about the various animes, and the 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 one girl there had never seen One Piece, and one of the other guys was like, "I've read all the manga,"
Mhm.
and so he wants to have a One Piece live action Netflix show.
Mhm.
Has zero to do with veganism. Has zero to do with activism.
Uh-huh.
Right? It's just a social thing.
Uh-huh.
Um, and he was like, "Yeah, would you go?" And I'm like, "Of course I'd go. That if I'm free, that would be awesome. That'd be so much fun."
Mhm.
And so I think yeah, there's already a desire to have that because the need for connection, the need for community is so strong
Mhm.
with people.
Mhm.
Um, so I can't see that stopping, whether we succeed or fail.
Mhm.
I can't see that stopping.
Nice.
Um, Politically, I don't know what the next issue would be. Um, I
I
think
have a
there's
weird question actually, if you don't mind me interrupting. We met
shoot.
recently. We you. I was lucky enough that you came to London,
Mhm.
and I took you to activism because that's I'm a cliche. That's all I do is I take people to activism. And we did some less. We did some less sort of aggressive, um, street outreach. Right? It wasn't megaphones at dawn. It wasn't. I think that we did have one TV, but it wasn't sort of like overtly. It was quite
Huh?
sunny, so it was hard to see. And we sort of just spoke to people with talking about like veganism, right? Like, is that something you would be interested in now that you've sort of seen it as like a it doesn't have to be really aggressive, or is path the thing that you think is your solid fit, and that's where you're going to stay?
I think I would definitely be interested in continuing to do that sort of thing,
Mhm,
in the less aggressive
mhm, mhm.
fashion. Um, and again, I've said it multiple times. There are different strokes for different folks. I think
Yeah,
there's a time and a place for the aggressive confrontation, the
I agree.
angrily make people uh, confront their own biases, their own internal programming.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I think more people are going to be swayed
Mhm.
by a more, you know, I'm not sure how to say it, a less aggressive method.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't. I've never really done this. I think I've been one. I did one disruption with Joey where we went into a supermarket with like megaphones and TVs, and I'd love to do that again. But we didn't really make vegans, right? We shocked people and we made people probably go away and think about stuff. But we didn't really make vegans. Sort of where I
Right.
shine is just having nice, polite conversations with people on the street. Um, Mostly with TVs, but we don't have to have TVs. And I think that's what I like. I think that's the thing I really enjoy. Um, but I also do other stuff. But I sort of, I suppose, the reason I ask, I suppose, is because you have such a big group, um, and hopefully it will continue to grow. There might be like other avenues of like sort of activism you can do because you have a large group, right? And because there's sort of like more directions you can go in. But I mean, I'm just really excited that you have such a huge community, and I hope it continues to grow.
Yeah, right now I think the focus is just on the election, right?
Yeah.
It's a very important election. Honestly, a
Oh
lot of
boy.
people say this. A lot of
Uh-huh.
people will say this. I've heard this sort of thing. I think this is one of the times it's really, really true.
Mhm,
This is an important election.
mhm,
We have put animals on the ballot,
mhm,
which is huge. But
mhm.
also on the ballot are humans,
Yeah,
which are
democracy.
also animals, but
Uh-huh.
democracy itself. I think the women's rights are
Mhm,
on the ballot.
mhm,
Uh, Gay, lesbian, trans rights are on the ballot.
mhm,
Uh, you know, workers' rights are on the ballot.
mhm,
Education, as we know it, is on the ballot.
mhm.
There are so many things on the ballot uh, that it's such an important election. I just hope people get out and vote,
Mhm,
um, and realize how important so many of these things are.
mhm.
And yeah, so the focus right now, I'll get back to you after the election is over, and we'll talk about the next steps then. But right now, the focus is really on like let's get through the election, let's get people to vote, um, let's have a victory for the animals,
Yeah. Oh.
and hopefully also victories for democracy, women, the LGBTQ population, um, and everyone else as well. I would admittedly be very, very sad if this particular ballot measure passes and
Mhm.
we lose everything else. So,
Yeah. 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 I think if you have to choose between Trump as president or no slaughterhouses in Denver, I think maybe for the good of everybody, it's a non-Trump presidency, right? But
mhm.
yeah, let's hope it's not an
Yeah.
either or situation.
Yeah, let's go for both.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you ever so much for being on. Usually I end by just sort of saying why I'm really glad you're on. I do this. I've done this for everybody. So, you know. But I think part of the reason I really wanted you on is because you uh, you were someone who, when we first spoke all those eons ago, I was hot headed and I wasn't very convincing. and you were a little bit sort of worried about activism. I think you had an opinion of what activism was, and I didn't really know to the extent that there were different types of activism, right? I definitely wouldn't have told you community building was a form of activism a year ago. Um, and I think sort of you are now very, very aware of the activism that makes you happy, and are doing it, and are doing a really good job of it, and have found a massive community. And that is an amazing story that I really want to show off, right? Because it shows that there is something for everyone somewhere that will suit all the things you need it to do, and will make the world a good place, and can make you happy and find lots of friends. So thank you ever so much for being on.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Boop. I love you very much.